Recording today. This is our lesson on April 24th, Monday. We're talking today about Iran and Egypt. We're going to spend most of our time on Iran, but briefly, homework. Oh, you can't see anything because this is in the way. I've already checked your homework note cards. If you're at home, I need to see a picture of your note cards, the answer side of all 22. Do that before you go over this lesson. I've checked assigned tests, and your homework is going to be that you're reading about the Persian Gulf War. It is related to today's lesson because you're reading about Saddam Hussein, except when we went to war against him. So that's lesson 78. Here are the note cards, and if you happen to have any extra time, I want to encourage you to keep studying the Africa map quiz. Any questions? All right, today we're going to spend our prayer time on what's happening in Iran today, modern, and we're going to pray for the women in Iran. David, if you could cut the lights. I want to start on this side of the board with this right question. And I want to ask you if you understand what the word liberal means. But I want to ask you this with a tactic where I get you to vote for me. So just so you know, the word liberal is kind of the opposite of the word conservative. So if I say the word liberal, in your book used this term. Your book said that Egypt is, under the Shah, had become liberal. When the word liberal is used, I want you to tell me whether you think positive connotation, liberal, that is a great thing when a country becomes liberal. Negative connotation, like it's a bad thing if a country becomes liberal, or somewhere in the middle. Okay? So give me a vote with your thumbs whether you think of the word liberal as having positive, negative, or somewhere in the middle connotations. And it's really fine, whatever you vote on this, it's not something, but vote something. DJ, are you listening? Mm-hmm. Vote something. Positive, negative, or somewhere in the middle. Okay. All right. So a lot of times, students that are in an environment like this, where your parents would probably, a lot of them would call themselves conservatives. A lot of times students think like, oh, well, liberal is bad. But the way the book was using the word liberal is really different. And I want you to first understand that the words conservative and liberal depend on where you're starting from. Conservative, the word conservative means wanting to conserve or to keep things the way they are or they have been. And the term liberal has to do with changing things. Sometimes we use the word progressive. Changing things, perhaps modernizing things, updating things. Now, if your parents think of themselves as conservative, what they're probably saying is there are a lot of things that don't need to be updated. There are a lot of things that don't need to be modernized because I think of them as being kind of biblical truths, and we don't need to go around updating that sort of stuff. But when we're talking about conservative and liberal in terms of what was happening in Iran, we're talking about things on the basis of having an Islamic law determining the way the country is. So, if the Islamic rule says that, for instance, women shouldn't get an education, and women shouldn't drive, and women shouldn't do things, and women are kind of like different from men, they're lesser than men, they exist to serve men. Then the conservative view would be to keep things like that, and the liberal view would be to modernize it, westernize it. Say like women should have more freedoms. So when the book said the Shah was modernizing Egypt, the Shah was really influenced by Western and American ideas and wanted his country to be more modern. Do you guys see what I'm saying, though? That's not the same as our concepts of liberal and conservative. We're basing them off of current American society. And, excuse me, I hope that didn't mess up my video. Good. All right. So now let's go back to the history of Iran and why we're talking about this. Do you guys know what a hijab is? Yeah. You've seen somebody wear a hijab, this sort of head covering before? Walking around Richmond, probably. In cultures where the women wear a hijab, usually the little girls don't until they hit an age, I think 12, where they will start to. What is the point of the hijab? Why do women wear this at all? To hide their hair. And why, Charlotte, would they want to hide their hair?
It's more necessarily so when they fall, like, so people don't look at them with
Okay.
and the products like that. And also, it's for so they hide their beauty, so people don't marry them for that. It's another reason.
Right. So it reflects a certain Islamic value which says that women should be modest and that marriages shouldn't be on the basis of, outward beauty. It's part of an expression of the Islamic faith. It's not only Islam that has an idea of women covering their heads, but it's also not only women who cover their heads. In Judaism, who covers their heads? In the Jewish faith. Have y'all ever seen Jewish people? Nope. Only men. You guys seen men with the little yarmulke? That is men covering their head because they're acknowledging that there is someone in authority over them, which is who? Who are men seeing as their authority? God, not Jesus. We're talking about the Jewish faith. Yes?
Actually, if you're Orthodox, a lot of women wear wigs.
Yes. And that's an acknowledgement of this. But in the Christian tradition, I don't know if your youth group has covered this quite yet in Bible study, but there are Bible verses in Corinthians that talk about women covering their head. Does anybody have any idea why the Bible might talk about women covering their heads? Not in the Islamic faith, but in the Christian Bible. Anyone? Coming up short here. Yes?
Usually it would be to show some respect.
Exactly. And in spiritually sense, it's an acknowledgement of authority. And who would the women be saying is an authority in their lives?
Their husbands,
Yeah.
maybe, or when the woman went to hold Jesus' feet.
Yes.
She covered over.
Yeah, their husbands, unless it's God Himself, and they don't have a husband or a father. So that's something that we don't usually see. There are some expressions of Christianity that do have women still cover their heads, like Mennonites do. I think Amish do too. But it's not typical in Christian churches. But it's not foreign to the Christian faith either. In the Islamic faith, it is one of the ways that women show that they're serious Muslims. So there are women who want to cover their heads. It's their choice, and they prefer it. Now, are they being forced to by men in their lives? I don't know. But there are still some women who want to, who choose that. There has the controversy over the hijab has gone on for a long time. When the Shah decided he really wanted to modernize the country, he made it illegal for women to wear the hijab. Okay? So this created a different problem. It made all the serious Muslims mad at him. Like, what do you mean I can't do this? Do you guys know that this has happened in modern day France too? Recently, there's a lot of Muslim immigrants in France, and when there were some problems in France that had to do with that was related to the Muslim community, the French president, today secular, modern French president, they were talking about making laws that did not allow women to wear a burqa, hijab, anything like that. It's not very free in some ways. But then, after the Islamic Revolution, it was the other way. All women have to wear the head coverings, or even the entire covering, all the way down to their toes. And you guys saw in the book, there was that crazy picture, like some community, do you remember where the women had on just like the mask? You couldn't see a thing of their person. DJ? Yes, please. So the controversy is that after the hijab law was changed, and this is what it is today in Iran. Today in Iran, women have to wear the hijab. I would have to wear the hijab if I went to Iran today. You would have to if you're over the age where it's required of you. This is enforced by something that is called the morality police. And they are as awful as it sounds. The morality police, yes. It is also enforced sometimes by traffic cameras. Women didn't wear the hijab, you get a ticket in the mail. You have to pay a penalty. It is not consistently enforced. It is sometimes enforced and sometimes not enforced. Which brings us to the problem today. Within this past year, I don't remember the actual date, this woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested by the morality police. Not for not wearing a hijab, but for wearing it improperly. For wearing it with more of her hair showing than was supposed to. And you can see in the protest banners that she does have her head covered, but she has hair hanging out. While she was in the custody of the morality police, she died. The Iranian authorities said she had a health condition. Her parents said she had no pre-existing health condition. And protests broke out across the nation because this woman died in the hands of the authority, and people suspected that she could have been tortured or she could have been mistreated by the authorities. These protests not only have spread, but it's men and women taking part in them. And the protests have spread. At first, women would protest by wearing the hijab with their hair pulled out a little bit. Now, some women choose to completely throw off the hijab and just go around with their heads uncovered. This is a dangerous and a massive protest in Iran today. This is a today thing. Just in this last week, 2 men were executed related to these protests. 529 so far have been killed in the course of the protest. 20,000 people, men and women, have been detained by the police. And 107 of them are on death row right now. All men, I believe. I don't know that the Iranian government wants to execute another woman at the moment because the world has eyes on Iran for what are considered violations of human rights. Yes?
Do the men have to be black women?
No, there's not a rule for them. There's general Islamic law, but the rule is for women to be modest.
Then how are men getting executed?
Because they're protesting along with the women. And they're being executed for standing up with the women for this. They're asking for freedom. They're not asking for no hijabs. They're asking for freedom to make their own choices. So I'll flip back to this one just to show you, as we open with prayer for these women, that when you see pictures of women who are protesting, it is often like that picture, the backs of their heads, because it is still dangerous for women to be photographed without a hijab. The morality police know how to use the internet too. And they also can look at pictures and find people if they are photographed like that violating laws. So let's stop and let's start our class today praying for those who are currently involved in a protest that's related to our lesson today. It is the most recent expression of all of the confusion that's happened when countries try to figure out how to run their countries with religious laws. All right, let's pray. Lord, we do ask that you would be with the women who are protesting in Iran today and give them courage to do whatever they feel is right. I know it must be hard even to make the decision about whether they want to go uncovered or wear the hijab, and we ask that you would help the women not to be judgmental of each other, but to allow each person to make her own choice about this. We ask that you would be with those men who have been standing up for what they feel is right and righteous, to support the women who have been sinned against. And mostly, Lord, we ask that in the middle of all of this chaos, that you would cause the spread of the gospel, that in a country that has historically been very, very hard on Christians, that you would allow the Christians who are there opportunities to share hope and faith with other people around them, and that you would give not only guidance, but that you would draw people to yourself to truly know you and find their peace, regardless of what happens to them in this protest. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. I need one person to do the practice on the Africa map. Do I have a volunteer? Anyone who's been practicing at all? I'm going to tell you about 3 countries. You guys can think about it, because I would love to have one volunteer. Is anyone inclined at all to do this? A little practice? Marielle, you think you have? Nope, that's not a hand. Anybody? We might go without then. Okay, I'm going to tell you about 3 countries, and if you'll pay attention when I tell you, it's going to help you. Last time I told you about the DRC, this large country, and it's easy to remember Republic of the Congo right next to it, so that helps you with those 2. Today I'm going to tell you about 3 more. Angola, this country right here first. Angola has the 2nd largest waterfall in Africa. What's the largest waterfall, the most famous one? Victoria Falls. It's amazingly gorgeous. Niagara Falls is in Canada. Well, it's on the border of America and U.S. and Canada. So it has, Angola has the 2nd largest waterfall. Angola also has the youngest population in Africa and a shortage of men. That's related to a war they had. It's also one of Africa's wealthiest countries. So when you look at Angola, I want you to think, now that's a wealthy country. In Angola, there is a country named Luanda that is the world's most expensive country for expats to live in. Expats is people like us, people from the outside. So it's not whatever other country is in your head. It's called the Paris of Africa, and it is the most expensive country. So think fancy and expensive right here in Angola. And if you go to Angola and you eat their food, you're going to have a stew-based diet, which means that everything will be served in bowls and it'll have broth. It's probably delicious too. So that's Angola for you. Second country I'm going to tell you about is Botswana. Botswana is the best place to see meerkats in the wild. Anybody a meerkat fan? You love meerkats? Yes, DJ? Botswana is Africa's oldest continuous democracy, and the place that you should go that if you like elephants, because it has the largest concentration of elephants. So, most likely to see elephants in Botswana. 70% of Botswana is also a desert, so it has the largest salt pan in the world. All right, so we did Angola, we did Botswana, and now Cameroon, right up here with these funny boundaries. In Cameroon, there are 230 spoken languages. It's hard to even imagine that many languages, isn't it? 230 are spoken, including French and English. The national, not elephants. The national animal of Cameroon is the lion. So I guess if you want to see lions, you go to Cameroon. And this was a super interesting fact. There are 3 of these in the world, but 2 of them in Cameroon. They are exploding lakes. So exploding lakes, they're not like geysers. Exploding lakes are actually really dangerous. In exploding lakes, it's somehow there's a concentrate of carbon dioxide that gets into the water, and it just builds up and builds up and builds up. I guess doesn't get balanced with oxygen until kaboom, it just explodes like a shaken up soda can. That same idea, it kabooms. So Cameroon has two of those. When the lake explodes, it doesn't happen often, but when the lake explodes, it kills everything in the vicinity because the carbon dioxide's too strong. And so it just like everything. So if you're standing there when the lake explodes, you're probably going to die. The air will go bad. You won't have any oxygen to breathe. So that's interesting about Cameroon, isn't it? Why are you covering your mouth? You think that's horrible? Yeah. Well, it'll hopefully help you remember Cameroon. Okay. I'm going to move on if nobody wants to practice our map for us. You guys should practice between now and then. Can you close the door so the sound doesn't get on our thing? All right, so you have your note cards, and you can turn the light on too, David. I want to start with this very, very, very important point, just for understanding these two lessons. There is a difference between Persian countries and Arab countries. Persia, the Persian Empire that you guys studied with like old history, ancient history, medieval history. The Persian Empire today is like Iran is one of the main parts of it. The Arab countries are lots of the countries in that area. When we get to the part where we're talking about Egypt and Israel, then we're talking about a conflict that has been a long-running conflict about the Arab countries hating Israel. And I want you to think about this for just a minute. Modern-day Israel has only been around since after which war? World War II. And why did it even get created after World War II, Charlotte? Right. The Jewish people who ought to have gone back to all of the countries in Eastern Europe, but their own people wouldn't take them back. Everybody wanted to just, pretend like the war hadn't happened. Pretend like they hadn't turned in their neighbors. Pretend like the Holocaust hadn't happened. So instead, these nations in charge, Great Britain, America, Soviet Union, created a country, a place right in the traditional place where Israel had always been, and said, here's the new Jewish nation. You guys go back to the place that has the Jewish heritage. Isn't this awesome? The Jews get to go back. They have their own homeland. They have their own nation. There's only one problem. The countries that did this did not create new land, did they? How did Israel as a nation even come to be? Where did the land come from? Where would the land come from if they said, here's a new nation, and all those 6 million Jews, or 8 million Jews, however many went, you guys all go there. Where did the land come from? Well, that's the good general answer. Like, it was just taken from other countries that were already there. So guess who was not a big fan of this whole process of creating a new nation of Israel? All the countries that lost their land, right? And so we have a history from that point, from 1948 on, of a lot of these countries hating Israel, hating it, because they took their land. Like, what are they doing taking our land? Pakistan in particular, or Palestine, which previously had a lot of that land. So, and these were countries that, we'll just say, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and America didn't care about at all. And it created conflicts that exist to this day, and wars that new nation of Israel had to be involved with, that were serious wars that they had to start fighting almost immediately after becoming a new nation. So when we get to the part, and we're learning about Egypt and Israel being in a war, Egypt felt like most of the Arab countries. The Arab countries really hated Israel. Yes?
May I use our stream?
The Persian countries, not so much, didn't care about this. This wasn't their issue. Persian countries are different. In Persia, they speak Persian. That's what Americans call it. Farsi is what they call it. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Farsi before. I don't mean you've heard Farsi. Good. That's like most of this class. You guys are way ahead of the other classes. You guys know people then that are Iranian refugees or something? Mm-hmm. You do? Oh, you're just saying yes?
Oh, yeah, one of the persons from the church.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And what about, who do you know that really? Yeah.
Oh,
That's really cool. You know somebody who speaks Farsi? That's awesome. So the Farsi speaking people are the Persians. They are, if you know somebody who's Persian, I mean, they are. They have fashion, they are beautiful, they are like really hip. Like the whole nation of Iran is full of really sophisticated, they're very educated people. But we have this revolution that happened, and which is sort of the imposition of religious law over the national law. This happened in 1979, and there's been this very back and forth, lots of kind of pushing and revolutions against it since then. You'll see here that Persian and Arabic, while they are related, the letters are not the same. There's similarities, but they're not the same. So the Persian people and the Arabic people are not the same. All right, let's go on then and talk about what got us to this point in Iranian history. And this is the Ayatollah Khomeini, this Shiite spiritual leader who turned politics. He formed the Islamic Republic. By the way, you guys understand that this was done by free people and fairly democratically, right? So when countries make a turn toward letting the law of their country be Islamic law, that doesn't mean that somebody took them over against their will. In Iran, it was the choice that was made by the people. Though it was a very complicated reason that it happened, it was still by the choice of the people. Right after the Iranian Revolution, there was a lot of propaganda, and this is an example of it. It says, had the Islamic Revolution and our great Imam Khomeini not existed, there would have been no hopes to end the hellish and mortifying dominion which the U.S. held over Iran. Guys, the Ayatollah Khomeini, his message to the Iranian people is that America was the great Satan. That's the actual terminology that he would have used. We are the great Satan. It would be like the same thing as if we said Putin is the Antichrist. We were the great Satan, but we, as a country, our entire country is the great Satan. Now, I know this seems like a little extreme and a little crazy, but listen, this is what he's saying. America is materialistic. America doesn't have good morality. The American people are not religiously disciplined, and American people want to use their capitalism to like influence the whole world. They're basically Satan.
All that is true.
There is, yeah.
The things that are true are not necessary.
Yes. So you're right. There is truth in everything he said. We are capitalistic. We are materialistic.
We're trying to make the world capitalist.
Mm-hmm. We make money off of our connections to other countries. And so he convinced the people that the rebelling against the Shah was the equivalent of rebelling against America, because the Shah's deep connection to the Western countries is where he got a lot of his power. All right. He was an imam, and the nation of Iran is Shiite Muslim. That's not the only kind of Muslim there is in the world. There are a special kind of Shiite Muslims that are called the Twelvers. And they believed in this really interesting idea. Tell me what this reminds you of. That there were historically there were these 12 special men that were very special, very holy, but the 12th one of them, a historical person, disappeared. But one day he will return. And when he returns, he's going to bring the fulfillment of all of the Muslim kind of dreams come true.
Sort of like a twisted Christianity.
It's a little similar to the Christian storyline.
So it sounds like the disciples, and so one of them, I would imagine one of them disappeared. I don't know.
Well, it's kind of this sort of throw Jesus in there as the 12th person because the person who comes back that we're waiting to come back is essentially a Messiah. They're waiting for the return of some messianic figure.
If anybody's ever read, which I have, it's really hard to read because it's basically you chop the Bible up and put it back together.
Yeah. So she's talking about the Quran. It can be a hard one.
The Quran is like the book that's where you come out.
There's the spiritual book. All right, so in the time in between waiting for this messianic imam to come back, there's other imams that sort of take the place, and of them, they saw the Ayatollah Khomeini as being one of the greatest imams, one of the greatest spiritual leaders, speaking for God, bringing the message of God to the people. These Shiite Muslims were really upset that the Shah was modernizing Iran. I've already sort of told you a little bit about this. But the Shah was letting things happen he was not letting Iran be Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist. He was just saying that the people didn't have to be so Islamic. They could be a lot of different types of Islamic, and it was all fine. We can all get along no matter what your type of Islam is. And devout Shiite Muslims thought that he was doing something wrong. He was diminishing the power of Islam in the government. Muslims really believe that the government leaders and the spiritual leaders should be like the same. Not all Muslims. I should not say that. That's very terrible for me to say that. Some types of Muslims believe that the spiritual leaders and the political leaders should be the same. Some Muslims think that there should be a separation of church and state. It's a big difference inside the Muslim community. And the Shah, obviously, though he was Muslim, thought that there should be a separation. This is a picture of Iran. I want you to look where it is. Iran touches the Caspian Sea. It's on the Persian Gulf. And look at this picture right here. Pakistan was a Soviet country. Afghanistan, a Soviet country. Turkmenistan, a Soviet country. All the stands up here were Soviet countries. Do you guys get how this felt like a Cold War era issue to the American government during this time? We're still in the Cold War era, and being on good terms with Iran, being allies with the Shah was like having a position to fight against the Soviets. That's why we were allies with the Shah. Also, they had a lot of oil. Iran has a lot of oil. They want to sell their oil to us. We wanted them as allies against the Soviets. It's a win-win. Everybody is happy, right? Everybody would be happy except for one thing that I don't even think our government really understood. The Persians and the Arabs are not the same. The Iranians did not represent that region. The Iranians were their own people, and a lot of the Arab countries thought the Iranians were arrogant, threatening, doing their own thing. They did not like it. In fact, a lot of the Arab countries were on the verge of going to war with Iran. It wasn't like we were getting some sort of ally in the area. Yay, us. It's more like we were getting allies with a nation that the other nations didn't even like. Until the Iranian Revolution caused Iran to be a Muslim country, and then the other Arab countries were kind of okay. They're like, you're okay now, because now you're run under Muslim law, so you're better. So this is the dynamics here. And I'll say, even though all this was happening, Iraq still went to war with them. So there was still a lot of conflict going on with the Arab countries in the area. turn off the lights. Let's watch a little bit of this video.
And again in 1953. So let's flash ahead to 1979. The Shah was definitely an autocrat, and he employed a ruthless secret police called the Savak to stifle dissent. In 1975, the Shah abolished Iran's 2 political parties and replaced them with one party, the Resurgence Party. You'll never guess who was resurging. The Shah. There was a huge round of censorship and arrests and torture of political prisoners, signaling that autocracy was in Iran to stay. But before those events in 1975, say between 1962 and 1975, by most economic and social measures, Iran saw huge improvements. In 1963, the Shah had tried to institute what he called a white revolution, top-down modernization led by the monarchy, and in many ways he was successful, especially in improving industry and education. Oil revenues rose from $555 million in 1964 to $20 billion in 1976. And the Shah's government invested a lot of that money in infrastructure and education. The population grew, infant mortality fell, a new professional middle class arose. But the White Revolution wasn't universally popular. For instance, it was opposed by one particular Shia cleric, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini spoke out against the White Revolution from the religious center of Iran, Qom. One of his main complaints was that the reforms would grant more rights to women, including the right to vote, but he also attacked the government for, quote, the rigging of elections and other constitutional abuses, neglect of the poor, and the sale of oil to Israel. And in general, Khomeini felt that a king's power was inherently un-Islamic and that Shia tradition was to fight that power. That noted about Khomeini, the 1979 revolution didn't start out to create an Islamic state. At first, it was a pretty typical uprising by dissatisfied Iranians to overthrow a government that they perceived as corrupt and unresponsive to their needs. In spite of, or arguably because of, oil-fueled economic growth, many Iranians weren't enjoying economic success. The universities were turning out more graduates than there were jobs, and the mechanization of agriculture had the predictable result of displacing farmers who moved to cities, especially the capital city of Tehran, where there weren't nearly enough jobs for the number of people. So I think it's unfair to say that a majority of the demonstrators who took to the streets in late 1978 were motivated by a fundamentalist vision of Islam. They were dissatisfied with economic inequality and political repression and a corrupt regime. So why do we generally remember the 1979 revolution as having been motivated by Shia Islam? Well, let's go to the thought bubble. So the initial demonstrations did begin after an Iranian newspaper on January 7, 1978 published an article that was critical of Khomeini. By the way, at the time he was living in Paris. These initial demonstrations were pretty small, but when the government police and army forces started firing on demonstrators, killing some of them, the protests grew. Each time marchers protested against the violent treatment to demonstrators, the government would crack down, and their violent reaction would spur more demonstrations. There was also a lot of criticism of the West tied up in the revolution. According to one woman who participated, American lifestyles had come to be imposed as an ideal, the ultimate goal. Americanism was the model. American popular culture, books, magazines, film had swept over our country like a flood. We found ourselves wondering, is there any room for our own culture? The Shah never understood why so many people were protesting against him. He thought that they were communists or being supported by the British. He also thought that merely bringing prosperity would be enough to keep him in power. It wasn't. On January 16, 1979, he left Iran. He eventually ended up in the U.S., which had unfortunate consequences for diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Iran. But the point here is that the first part of the Iranian Revolution was relatively peaceful protest followed by a government crackdown, more protests that eventually led to the collapse of the monarchy. And that looks kind of familiar, especially if you've studied like the French or Russian or even the American revolutions. And most historians argue these protests weren't about Islam, but rather the discontent over living conditions, pay cuts, and the threat of unemployment fused with the general disillusionment and anger with the regime. The government that eventually replaced the monarchy was the second, and in many ways much more revolutionary revolution. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the new Islamic Republic of Iran. And again,
let me move on from there. You can turn the lights back on. Okay, so that gives us a good kind of sum up to this point. The Khomeini, he lived in Turkey and Iraq. He lived in Paris, France, and from here, the successful Iranian Revolution brought Ayatollah Khomeini to power in a way that involved no bloodshed, like no money being exchanged, no class warfare, really nothing that normally happens in a revolution. So the word revolution simply lets us know that it was a complete change of everything. Not that there was any fighting that happened. No fighting, just that. Okay, that's the uniqueness there. The president at this time was Jimmy Carter. And you guys remember from reading the book that Jimmy Carter was the one who allowed the Shah to come under guise to our state to get treatment at an American hospital. I'm going to post a video for you to watch. It's on Google Classroom, a PBS video. But it describes in part how Jimmy Carter sat at a table of his advisors. And he said to them, okay, this guy, the Shah, we know him personally. We've worked with him for years, but he's out of power. He needs cancer treatment. Should we let him in? Go around the table and everybody pretty much was like, yeah, let's let him in. Let's let him come get treatment. President Carter said, if we do this, there might be a problem with this. In Tehran, in the capital city of Iran, they might go into our embassy and take some of our people hostage or something like that. It's like Carter knew this was a really strong possibility. They still allowed the Shah to come because they felt like they had a connection with him. And indeed, just a couple weeks after that, the very thing that Carter feared happened. President Carter carried this as a personal burden and really saw this as something that he felt responsible for. It lasted so long, 444 days, that they had the Americans in hostage, as hostages. The United States themselves, in the middle of all this, tried to negotiate, and Carter negotiated to the very end of his presidency. Stayed up all night. The night before, President Reagan, the next president, got installed as president, inaugurated, and didn't sleep. He did all of these negotiations. Now, President Reagan and his campaign had said, I will never negotiate with these terrorists. In the end, the Iranians wanted to get something out of this, so they wanted to take Carter's deal, but they didn't want to give Carter credit for it. So they basically took the deal that they made with Carter, but didn't release the hostages until 20 minutes after Reagan became president, so that Carter wouldn't get the credit for it. Carter didn't care. He was just so glad they were relieved, and like your book said, he welcomed them all home afterwards. In the middle of all this happening, now Iran is under this Islamic rule. Iraq invades Iran. Iraq, by the way, is the country that you're going to be reading about between now and Wednesday, the Persian Gulf Wars. It's all about this area. The United States didn't help, but we gave intelligence to Iraq, and we gave them mustard gas, which was illegal for the United States to use, but we gave it to Iraq to use on the Iranian people. Last thing I wanted to say about this hostage crisis is that you all are used to a 24-hour news cycle, like news all the time, but this did not exist before the Iran hostage crisis. Guys, y'all stay focused with me for a little bit longer. What happened when it was like day 1, day 2, day 132, day 244, is that the hostage takers got free advertisements. They're constantly getting a platform to make their points. Pressure was on the president all the time, and people were sitting around in their living rooms watching TV constantly. And guess what the TV networks figured out? They made a ton of money. They realized that hyping up crises, but be still, stop doing that. Hyping up crises is a great TV strategy. And we have inherited now this 24-hour news cycle, because as long as they keep us thinking there's a crisis all the time, we will keep watching their news stations. So our current social media environment has its roots in the Iran hostage crisis. The Ayatollah Khomeini instituted a strict dress for women, not just head coverings, but full body cloaks. You've probably seen those pictures before. Forbade American music and forbade American movies. Can you cut the lights really fast, and I want to show you one more picture here. This is before the revolution. These are politicians in Iran This is post-revolution. This is the difference in what happened. These are two of the Iranian women who helped run the country. There's an Iranian politician post-revolution. The revolution has had a massive impact on the culture of Iran. Turn the lights back on. All right, so I told you I was going to close up telling you a little bit more about Anwar Sadat, whom I consider a hero because he created a situation where there was a peace treaty signed in an environment where the Arab nations hated Israel. And I've already referenced this from the beginning. Egypt had gotten its independence from Great Britain at great cost, and everybody in the region in Egypt despised and resented Israel. So look at this picture here. Here's Israel. It touches this gulf right here at the city of Eilat. This is the only way for it to get through. So when the Strait of Tiran was closed, it was considered an act of war. And when Israel attacked, here's Egypt over here. When it attacked, it ended up taking the Sinai Peninsula, this right here. What I want to say about this is that it was an absolute miracle for little tiny new nation of Israel to beat an established larger nation and to take this massive amount of land plus spreading out this way. Israel was proving itself as being worthy of actually being a nation. This Yom Kippur War, 6 Days War in 1967, Yom Kippur War in 1973, were wars that proved that Israel could be a power in the world. But this is Eilat. This is the tip city. When Anwar Sadat changed his tune, he did something really amazing with President Carter. This is under President Carter at Camp David. He negotiated a treaty where Egypt got back that Sinai Peninsula, that huge piece of land, got it back, and also made peace with Israel. It's actually like good for both sides. But what he was doing was acknowledging Israel's right to be a country in an Arab world that hated Israel and wanted it to disappear. And because Anwar Sadat did that, because he had this positive posture toward Israel, this is a famous picture of the Israeli Prime Minister and Anwar Sadat shaking hands with President Carter. Because of this, he was assassinated by this group called the Muslim Brotherhood, which is not always a terrorist organization, but they have spawned many terrorist organizations. They saw this as a betrayal. They killed Sadat. And I think he should go down in history as somebody who did a rather magnificent job of bringing the world to peace. It is almost impossible for me to give you an update on Egypt because the history of Egypt since then has been really, really complex. Iran is almost easier than Egypt. But I'll just suffice it to say, I'd rather stop and pause here and just say Anwar Sadat's peace treaty with Israel was a remarkable and kind of like paradigm shifting thing that happened in that region. It has not brought peace to the whole region, but it did something really positive for both Egypt and Israel when this happened. All right, that's it for today.